Welcome to the Winning E-commerce Experience Show, where it's all about creating a brand that your customers love so they keep coming back. This show is brought to you by DataCue. Your store experience begins with your homepage. DataCue improves your conversion rate up to 30% by showing each visitor a personalized homepage based on their interest. And now, your host, Shahram Anver.
Hey guys, welcome to, I'd say, our first podcast episode that's on video. So we're going to see how this goes. Today we've got the CEO of Pure Web Results. They're a consulting firm that helps e-commerce brands sustainably scale through holistic, data-driven marketing frameworks. That's a mouthful. Josh Boone, great to have you on the show, man.
Great to be here, man.
Yeah, so we were just talking about, in the intros, you said something really interesting to me because you're talking about how too many marketing folks really go with I feel,
Mm-hmm.
and like the kind of decision making. So, and I think that's probably going to be even more so with this pandemic going on because there's so many opinions flying around, and I'd say precious little data, right? So where did you get this sense, and like, what did you decide to do about it with like attacking this I feel thing?
Wow. I overall, I grew up in small business, and I've had several businesses of my own where it's just like you've got to make decisions and you got to think about cash flow. You got to do what works. So I've always kind of had that very pragmatic approach. But then when I started getting into consulting a couple of years ago, transitioning from that after my agency, I started getting really, when you have an agency, you're dealing with like a marketing director, a CMO, CEO, owner, whatever else. But then when I was in the consulting side and I got to really deep dive into these organizations and start talking with everybody, from the content development team, product development team, customer service, everyone, I just didn't have that kind of holistic, top-down kind of, 360 view of an organization and the team. And when you're just talking with like a marketing director or CMO, like they kind of whether they realize it or not, they start giving you oh, everything's great. They kind of give you this perception of having this unity, but then you start talking about all the layers of the people that work there, and you're just like, okay, things are not as unified. They're not as unified as you think. And a lot of people felt like the wrong decisions were being made. And, you talk to, the leadership, and a lot of the time it makes sense based on the information they're telling you. But then you start getting into the weeds, you start dealing with the developers, the copywriters, whatever else that have the data and are doing the day to day. And a lot of the time they felt like they weren't being listened to. And it came down kind of to like an ego thing where it's like, I have more experience than you, I'm your boss, whatever. And sometimes it wasn't, it was very subtle, but it was there. So one of the things that we started trying to do was I at first, I started kind of taking some of their ideas and just, presenting it as if it were my own, not to take credit, but in tandem and working with the team. Working with the team. I would tell them I was going to do this. And then I would kind of present it, and they're like, that's a great idea. And I'm like, well, it's kind of funny because, this guy has been saying it for apparently like 6 months now. So what we were doing is at that point, then finding how can we test this? How can we test these assumptions? How can we gather data? And then we let it to do. So then as we started doing this, it became a culture of not ego or seniority or whatever. You would put the ideas out there. We would come up with tests, and then we would vet it. And then whatever won.
So you essentially really focused on building a system to surface these ideas by people on the ground to people who are making decisions. Is that how you'd say it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, I mean, even with a small business, I suppose we all fall into the same trap, right? The more you're talking to your customers, the more you're actually seeing maybe opportunities, or I think, you use the word blind spots a lot on your website, that you might not see if you're up in your ivory tower, just planning things, essentially, if you're not listening, you're trying to make the world follow the way you want it to be, rather than trying to understand how the world really is and adjusting your business to work with that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
and
go ahead.
No, go for it.
No, so I guess what I was trying to go with that is that with small business, how would you change your approach at all? Where I guess with small business you have lesser layers, but perhaps then it's more about the small business owner speaking to the customer more rather than the developer.
Yeah. So I think it's in a way more and less important for a small business for different reasons. So I think you have less layers, like you're saying, less layers to get for complication to come in. But also, what I found with a lot of small businesses is that a lot of the times, I mean, I'm guilty of this myself. A lot of times, like the small businesses kind of start off as like a lone wolf, kind of person who just didn't really, they wanted to march to the beat of their own drum, and so like that can be an issue as well. Is that they're actually so engaged that can end up being an issue as well. But what I would also say is that that relationship that you can have with your customers and being able to develop that very authentic, very deep, that is a great asset for a smaller, more agile brand or business that larger companies just simply don't have. And that's one of the biggest opportunities that I'm seeing right now, is to have that authentic voice and to connect with your customer in a very sincere way, because there's a lot of opportunity right now. There's a ton. And the thing is that these larger or brands and businesses are putting a lot, they're now trying to seize that opportunity, and they're putting a lot of money into it. And that can seem very deflating for a small business. But the thing is that let them do it. Let them do it, because what that's doing is it's they are putting a lot of money and driving demand for whatever it is that you're doing, but they're not going to be able to resonate and speak to your customer in the way that you can, because there's just too many, there are too many layers are removed, and there's too many things. You having more control and being willing to take more risk and being able to be, just much more on the level with your customers and have that more authentic relationship, like that is going to be the thing that's a differentiating factor. And particularly now, where I see so many brands that are kind of breaking down the traditional kind of barriers, if you will, and being way more transparent with their customers. Like that is huge. People want that. They're sick of inauthenticity. They're sick of fakeness. And you get to look at that from politics to whatever else, it doesn't matter. But across the board, like if you can speak very directly and very sincerely, like that'll resonate.
Especially if you're that lone wolf or that founder kind of role, right? Then you're kind of merging your business identity with your own identity, and then that it becomes so much more easier to be authentic rather than this massive, gigantic operation where you can't really have one person embody the tone or the voice, so to speak, right?
Yeah. I mean, Simon Sinek speaks often about, start with why. Why do you have your business? Why do you exist? What do you do that you do? I mean, that's why it's like if you're someone who is very much so like the face, and you're comfortable with being a face and being a personality for your brand, getting out, trying to have conversations, go on podcasts like we're doing right now and share that information, and go on, Reddit, for example, is one of the probably the biggest untapped marketing channel. That's just not very many people are doing well. Not many people are really doing it all. Even fewer people are doing it well. So if you can tap into that.
Like, how would you tap into it? I mean, I know it's a bit of a segue, but like, how would you approach tapping into Reddit? Because I have to admit, I'm not a big Reddit user either, and I've always been fascinated by the world of Reddit.
Yeah, we were actually in the process of putting together a fairly extensive kind of, I don't know if we're going to release it as a white paper or what yet. We're still kind of figuring that out. But I've been on Reddit for probably like, I don't know, since the dig exodus back in the day, like probably like 2008, whenever that was.
Wow.
So I've been using it for a very long time. I actually hosted a bunch of Reddit meetups in my hometown, like back in 2010, and I was surprised by the turnout. Like even that was over 10 years ago. So it's just like been on it for a long time. And the main kind of thing of it is that authenticity. Like Redditors do not respect like brands that come in, even personalities. There's so many case studies of seeing celebrities going on and doing AMAs and just bombing because it seems contrived. It seems like they're doing it. But then there's plenty of examples where celebrities go on there, people that they didn't even like the celebrity or their brand or their company or whatever at first, just based on their perception. And then it's like Reddit fell in love with them because they were so honest and transparent.
Right.
So as far as like how I would go about it, it varies a little bit depending on what, your industry you're in and the specifications of everything. But first of all, I'd be like, okay, where are your users? Look for subreddits and just spend time. Don't come up with a marketing plan right now. Just spend time getting engaged, make an account on there, follow it, see what kind of content is resonating, see what kind of influencers are on that community, people that are,
Mm-hmm.
the top posts. There's plenty of tools that you can find for how to find the top users in any sort of community, related communities. There's plenty of tools out there. Just search for it, and then figure out, okay, what is your point of entry? How can you have an authentic, how can you provide content
Mm-hmm.
and do it? One example is like we're one of the long, evergreen kind of content. We're working with one of our clients now to come up with these kind of content hubs, like long
Okay.
term guides and whatever else. And they're craftsmen. They have extreme knowledge in what they're doing. So we've actually been using Reddit to source ideas for what users are looking for, what are the pain points, what are advice that they have, and kind of putting all this together and mixing it with their in-house team's expertise. And what I told them to do is like, well, go on Reddit and just say, hey, this was, we're doing this, and we're one of you guys. What do you guys think? And getting them involved in the process, and then following back up later and saying, hey, we wrote this guide based on your guys' advice and your direction and what we've seen in the community. What do you guys think? How can we make it better? And then you're not, delivering this final thing to them. It's part of almost like a community service in a way, like you're distilling something down. So it's like that would be one example of how you can authentically do it, and they can actually help you, develop your content. It can be win-win. It doesn't have to be, transactional.
I don't know if I've got this right, but I can't remember his name. Was it Andy Weir? He wrote The Martian. Didn't he write this with Reddit?
I'm not sure, but that wouldn't surprise me.
I have to Google this, but apparently it was something like he couldn't get published, so he started writing and he posted it on Reddit or some site. I'm pretty sure it was Reddit, and people would give him feedback on the scientific facts which he was using and things like that. And he used that feedback and ended up having this insanely good book, and was made obviously into a movie as well. So I think that's really cool. It sounds like I mean, especially if, as a small business, like the Lone Wolf or whoever, like if you are building a product that's very personal to you, then I clearly suggest that you know a lot about that product that maybe you could share, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of information that you can share, and you can also, be humble and ask for, both provide and then also give information. So it's like there's plenty of e-commerce subreddits as well. There's marketing subreddits, e-commerce startups, drop shipping subreddits for people that are doing that.
Sure.
And you can go on there and people will just give advice. I mean, I give advice to people on there all the time as well. People will be like, hey, I just started the store. What do you think? And if I have the time, I'll provide some feedback. And there are tons of people on there of all various, you know, anywhere in their career. I mean, so you can
Right.
get a lot of really good advice from people on there as well.
And like you said, I guess a lot of this advice is very contextual to the situation of the business, right? Because
Yeah.
the moment this pandemic struck, it clearly was no longer business as usual.
Mm-hmm.
I was seeing this report, and it seems fairly obvious now, but basically some industries have seen huge booms and some industries have seen clear declines, and some have just gone to zero. I don't want to say zero, but it's very low. So for instance, travel, I don't think
Yeah.
anyone is thinking of traveling right now.
Yeah.
But if you're selling equipment for, say, home office or I don't know, groceries or things like that, clearly you're in demand and you've got very different kind of issues. I guess it's that middle segment, so to speak. I mean, travel, I'm not sure there's something right now that you can do. I guess you really just need to hang on for, whatever whenever this is going to be over. But that middle segment where you've got a product and maybe it's not the first thing that people are thinking about right now. And one of the things I've seen with this segment is that it really comes down to your creativity on how you can perhaps sort of pitch that product in a way that people actually demand. So, for instance, um, we were talking to this company that does stationery, and they realized that, well, if people are going to be stuck at home, maybe they're going to want something to doodle on or do something with their kids. So it's the same product, but they just found another niche to go for.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe these kind of ideas could be also they could get these from Reddit. So maybe they could go on these sites and be like, hey, we've got this kind of product. We're thinking about these ideas to make it more relevant to people right now. What do you guys think? Have you seen anything like that, like in terms of product sort of innovation or how people are rethinking how they brand the store?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, across the board. I mean, I've actually got examples and several of the ones that you just mentioned. Like for example, travel. We've actually got a client in the travel industry, and as you can imagine, I mean, revenue dropped pretty severely, but also they're a pretty lean team, and a lot of their direct competitors are much larger with a lot of employees, a lot of overhead, and all these other things. So I was talking with the CEO, and I'm like, okay, well, you have a great voice. Like she just can speak to people very, very great, and she has a lot of knowledge. And I'm like, you should be going on to
Mm.
go to PR, go on podcasts. There's things like help a reporter out. You can go on, and I mean that's how I think we connected. It's like you
Yeah.
can go on there and you can see what people what kind of experts people are looking for and start building that and helping people. You as a travel expert, like both what can people in the industry do and like what would you advise customers doing, like just
Mm.
sharing that experience. Like that's one way that you can start being proactive and getting ahead, building your thought leadership, getting a lot of backlinks to your website, which is fantastic for SEO. SEO is kind of like my background, and so there's fantastic things you can do in the meantime of that. Home office, that's another one where it's like one of our clients that actually was in the process of transitioning. We're working with them on the strategy of kind of getting ahead in the home office area, and then this happens. So
Right.
what we
That's
thought
amazing.
was like, yeah, what we thought was going to be a year or two process
Right.
ended up being months, even days, and so it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where it's like, okay,
Right.
you could see that as a negative because now these much larger brands are now starting to put everything that they can into it. But again, what it's doing is driving demand,
Yeah.
and people, the stuff that's coming out that we're seeing already from these larger brands is really subpar in quality, and these people do not understand the clientele. This expert I'm talking, the brand that I'm talking about, like they're experts in the US and stuff. Like they've been studying and researching their clients, their customers, how they use their products for years. Even their CEO actually went around the country and just met with their customers, interviewed them. I mean,
Wow.
like a real heavy layer of dedication. Those
Yeah.
larger brands cannot compete with that. So they're also facing an issue because they've, took it upon themselves to voluntarily shut down production to help their employees, but they're in the Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
So they are now busier than they've ever been,
Mm-hmm.
and yet they're having to shut down production. But so what we're doing in the meantime is, okay, how can we get ahead? How can we create this content? How can we start positioning you guys so that when you're able to ramp back that things back up, you guys are ahead of things, and starting to use that time, now that their crew is not actually, their designers and everything else, their craftsmen are not actually making these things. Well,
Right.
now we can tap into them and have them help, go on Reddit or do whatever else, and be, thought leaders in that space and share their expertise. So there is ways. I mean, overall, I would say like this is innovate or die. Like, I mean, I'm not trying to be insensitive, but it's the reality. I mean, my sister's a nurse at a hospital, so it's like I very personally, have a connection to this. So I'm not trying to take away from the series, but this is innovate or die right now. And like, my colleague Zaid, he's like, we're going back to Oregon Trail. It's like it's you and your gun, and that's it. And it's just like, and I love that. And it's just like really, this is going back to first principles. And the
Yeah.
smaller agile brands, you guys already are existing in this space where you got to be surgical, you got to be tactical. So it's just like take the skill set that you have, the things that have kept you going so far, and just amplify it, double down on it. And like now's the time
Yeah.
to get experimental and to try things.
And I think that's advice we can also use. I mean, at least even for me personally, right? It's just anyone who's running a business, no matter how well you think you're doing or not, I think it's always a good thing to go back to first principles and just really give yourself an honest evaluation. And
Yeah.
I know this is a topic that's very dear to you because I think, you're all about helping people figure out that machine, that growth machine.
Yeah.
So I guess like people listening in are probably thinking, okay, I think I'm doing all right. What are things I should look for? And other people who are like, well, I think there's a lot of areas that I can improve. So maybe let's talk about maybe that framework that you've got in terms of first principles. So, how would you
Mhm.
evaluate a business health, and what are the things you think would be the most important for an entrepreneur to be thinking about right now?
So I guess I'll just kind of get into the history of the framework, and then we'll get
Yeah.
into the, how does that come into now. But I've been working. I had an agency for about 6 years. Full service marketing agency. We've worked with a lot of tons of businesses of all kinds, and I started seeing a lot of the same issues over and over again. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're an agency, there's kind of a bottleneck of how deeper you can get into their organization and their problems, and you're juggling so many clients where it's just like you just can't you can't get that deep into it, even if you want to. So then, I left the agency, sold it, and took some time off. And then when I was deciding what I wanted to do next, like I was thinking like, I'm going to get into consulting, but I don't want to just be a normal consultant. Like I want to work on a hard problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I started thinking about, okay, well, there was a lot of these same issues across everything from e-commerce to B2B, completely different industries, like, from fashion to like obscure high tech stuff that I didn't even know existed until I met them.
Mm-hmm.
And they all started having a lot of the same fundamental problems. So when we started consulting, we worked with, a couple larger brands and, $100 million companies, and started, that had rapid growth. And they went from like 10 to 20 to 50, 60 employees like within just a couple of years. And what I noticed is that they started having massive blind spots in their strategies. So I consider a blind spot something internally that gaps in your strategic thinking. And on the inverse side, a competitor's blind spot for you would be an opportunity. That's an opportunity that you can kind of seize. You can seize that opportunity by taking advantage and kind of penetrating that their own weaknesses and gaps. And I can give you some examples in a minute. But so what started happening was we were trying to figure out and fix these issues, these scaling issues. And that's where it goes back into the employees that we're talking to, across the board. Like we started talking with all levels of the organization and started seeing these gaps, and we started fixing them, and we started seeing that.
So
Go
what are
ahead.
the gaps that you saw? Like, just like a rough sort of summary, like what were the major themes that you saw by talking to these companies, the common problems that you saw? I mean, I know you mentioned the strategic blind spots, but is there
Mhm.
anything else that like you just keep seeing over and over again that really annoyed you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest one is their over reliance on certain marketing channels. That's a huge
Okay.
one.
Right.
So it got to a point where one of these brands we came in on, and this is right when the whole Cambridge Analytica thing was going on with Facebook and all this other
Mm-hmm.
stuff. It was kind of a hot topic. It was right when that was bubbling up. Their Facebook account rep, and this is a company, by the way, that's doing like millions of dollars a month with Facebook and IG spend, uh, pulled him aside and was like, "Hey, you guys are too heavy. Like, you're too reliant on us. Like you're too heavy." Because they were basically their account rep was like, "I think we have some algorithm changes happening, may or may not affect you guys, but we're worried about it really seriously hurting your scale, your revenue, and you being mad at me." So
So let
he
me
was
get this
just, I
straight.
mean, this,
The
yes,
Facebook told the company that we think you're too reliant on us.
yes.
That is something. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
I
Go
told
go.
them that. I told them that a week prior, and they're like, "Yeah, yeah, we think you're right. Yeah, we'll get around to it." And then the Facebook gets, and they're like, "Okay, okay, you were right. Okay, what do we do?" And that's when we started developing the game plan. But so what happens? What I see a lot of times, all right, is you have these startups, and I see the same thing happening even if they're strictly cash flow, 100% owner, smaller, e-commerce shop, or if they're VC. Same issues, but with a VC route, where they're getting funding and they're kind of having this explosive growth. I see it way, way, way more. And usually it's like there is a channel that they start with, whether
Mm-hmm.
that be, okay, your SEO, or it's pay per click, or it's paid social, or it's influencers, or whatever it is. You have a channel typically that's kind of like the thing that you lean on. And then what happens is you start scaling and growing, and you just become way too heavily reliant on that. And because you have all this data, you've been spending all this time and money on it, you got to really optimize and dial down. So then when you start experimenting with the other channels, it's not performing as well. So you're just like, well, you want that hockey stick growth. So you start putting all the money. And particularly if you're a venture-backed company, the VCs, that kind of insidious hand, are just like, no, let's put effort towards that thing right there. Keep putting more into the money machine. We want that. But what's happening is that they're not developing. Think of it like going to the like you're just doing push-ups. So you just, you're just making your arms like Popeye, but like you're not doing any sort of cardio, and you have no endurance whatsoever with your legs at all.
Sure.
So it's just like, that's what a lot of these businesses are happening. So, to give you an example, I come in and I'm like, okay, you guys are way too reliant on this one channel. You have huge opportunities, particularly like an SEO, massive opportunities that I'm seeing that they're not even doing. And that to me is, I'm like, okay, well, you guys want to overtake this larger competitor. Like, this is kind of your goal. You want to be them or beat them. Well, there's huge, you're competing on their strength, but they have these massive blind spots where their SEO game is terrible. And the only reason they're even ranking is basically just on their brand authority.
Interesting.
So you can be surgical and you can put effort into overtaking them. And we did this countless times. Well, there was one D2C brand we were working with, and there was a certain type of fabric in their clothing that a much larger brand had just kind of dominated. And this company had that kind of new emerging kind of fabric and that style of clothing, but they didn't have any sort of non-branded. They weren't optimized at all for it. They just had this collection, but they didn't specify any of the details, so they didn't show up for anything. And I'm like, that's so when I'm looking at this, the big company they want to go after, again, they're just phoning it in. They're ranking just by default because nobody else is doing it well, and they're the biggest fish in that pond. So we put effort into that.
So that would be a blind spot, right? In your
Yes.
definition, right?
Yeah. So for the larger, for their competitor, the competitor, that's a blind spot for them. But for the smaller company that I'm working with, still pretty sizable, but smaller than them, that's an opportunity. So then what we were doing is we put that together, and within 6 months, like basically they just dominated pretty much everything.
So how would you differentiate between, it sounds like there's two kinds of blind spots, right? And I think you alluded to this a little bit earlier. One is these blind spots where you're just doing something wrong and you haven't noticed it. And then there's this other one where the competitor is doing something which you can quote unquote exploit. How would you say prioritize between the two, right? Because they're actually kind of different, right? In this case, you've seen this big company that's doing really well just by default. Do you look at it in terms of revenue potential? I guess you're going to make a list of all of these blind spots, competitor and myself, and then you're going to prioritize it. Maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but how do you think about this?
Yeah, and that's where having the data, generating tests and having the data, looking at it comes into play, because then you can kind of look at, okay, well, what's the, I basically there's two. You have the growth potential, and then you have the kind of risk mitigation. Those are the two ways that I look at it. Is like, what is the potential risk of not covering, kind of filling the gaps internally that you have, and because the same process that we're taking here, like, okay, that larger competitor, I want to take that on. They have, they have blind spots, and we can seize that. Well, guess what? Anyone that's below you or on the same level as you is looking at the exact same thing for you. So you constantly have to look at the difference between defense and offense, and that can be, that's really situational. But what I would say is it depends on like where you currently are as a business and then your industry. For example, if you have an emerging, let's say there's an emerging market like within your industry. So in this case, maybe it's like work from home or whatever else. It's something that's happening. It's really hot. That it's almost like the gain potential of that far exceeds maybe any potential blind spots that you have. But also on the same end, let's say that you are on the opposite end of the spectrum where you're kind of a little bit more dominant in that area, but it is emerging market, but you are kind of number one. So it's almost the exact same circumstance I just said earlier. If that's the case, don't just assume that you're going to keep being number one. If that is an emerging space that is increasingly valuable, you might want to double down on that and be more proactive in the kind of defensive and securing that position. So it really just comes down to, again, innovate or die. It's like you have to be very lean. You have to really kind of analyze the data and kind of do that 80-20 analysis and kind of come up with the game plan from there.
So I think this is a really great exercise for anyone to actually do, right? So given that we're in this situation, and I think there's I'd say significantly more downtime than there probably was before. It's a perfect time to get out that list, write out what you think these blind spots are, and weigh them, risk versus growth potential. So
Mhm.
we've talked about over reliance on specific marketing channels. Is there anything else that you've seen which you feel that more businesses really need to be careful about?
Yeah, I think in general, it's just not investing in the long term. I mean, I could
Mm,
go down a billion rabbit holes on all the specifics, but I mean,
right.
the crux of it all is that they're just not investing. I've seen so many businesses literally have, you know, having all everything laid out in front of them. Hey, this is huge opportunity. You guys should really do, and they all agree. And then they turn around and be like, well, actually, you know, for, you know, the next quarter, we really want to hit these revenue goals, and we're just going to put that money towards, you know, ad
Right.
spend or whatever else.
Right.
And then this kind of thing happens. And so it's just like, you know, there's a lot of brands right now that are suffering from this quicker and at a much greater extent than they've maybe is justified because of
Hmm.
how they kind of assumed that everything would just continue, and they weren't thinking about the long term. And, you know, it's like for me, you know, I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. I grew up, you know, my dad had a tree service, and I grew up with that seasonality. You know, I also grew up in the Rust Belt here in Ohio, where it's just like, you know, you growing up and kind of going downtown and seeing the kind of the ruins of this, you know, once great city. And, you know, thankfully now it's bouncing back pretty well. But you know, growing up with that and seeing that, and then also, you know, with your, you know, seeing the seasonality of like, hey, in the winter you survive, you have to survive off of what you had during the summer, you know, when you had
Hmm.
the good months. And then also maybe you have firewood sales, but what happens if you know, had a bad year where you just didn't have a lot of firewood you could season? Or what if you you know, you know, you just didn't do well or whatever else? It's like, you got to think about that. And I think a lot of these businesses, um, they just kind of assumed that they could keep kind of covering up these larger strategic gaps with just revenue. And what happens
Mm,
when the revenue starts slipping? And now we're seeing, you know, I see this less so as like this massive destroying force, and more of right now, at least, this is more of an unveiling of what was kind of already there for a lot of businesses. Um,
harsh but true, I think.
look, hey, yeah, it is harsh, but it is the reality. And the
Yeah.
thing is like, I find it to be, for a lot of brands, quite lazy.
Hmm.
Smaller businesses, not so much, because I mean, you have to be lean and surgical by default. But for a lot of these larger businesses, yeah, they just weren't really prioritizing things. And what I see out of that, kind of the last you know, major point on what I'm consistently seeing is, it trickles down into the the well-being and the mental health of their team. And
Hmm.
this is something that is really not talked about as much as I wish it was, is that these short-term kind of goals, pursuing it's really stressful, because usually most of these teams are just random acts of improvement, and there's all these really cool ideas that they want to work on, but they're just kind of doing these needless things just to
Right.
get, you know, the hockey stick growth. And they get frustrated. And then when they, you know, the inevitable happens, like right now, where now layoffs are happening, they're just like, well, yeah, I kind of saw this stuff happening to begin with. These are these issues that are now leading to these layoffs. You know, this could have been prevented, and it's really not good. And you have these you know, people in the marketing department across the entire team that are stressed out, are doing random acts of improvement. They're all competing. They're all like basically they're not working collaboratively, which is the biggest issue, is that they're kind of eating into each other's work. So, and for a good example of that is, like, let's say the paid you know, paid click, pay per
Hmm.
click, you know, SEM. You can utilize a lot of those learnings and apply it to SEO. So what a lot of the times what we'll do is we'll actually come up with, you know, see what some in the marketplace, what some opportunities are for
Hmm.
search. And then instead of going on and, you know, developing this, you know, a tremendous amount of evergreen content, and you're putting, you know, a year or two into building those pages up, what we'll do is we'll test this with paid search. We'll create really quick landing pages. We'll target those keywords with ads, and we'll see how well they do. And if they perform, then it's like, okay, we'll invest in that. and we'll invest in,
Yes, with content.
absolutely. And so those are ways you can work collaboratively. But in a lot of times with these teams, those are completely different departments, which is pretty
Got
crazy
it.
to me. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, and I mean, I think the point that you made about thinking long term really struck a chord in me, because I was just talking about this with um, my sister, actually, who's also a business owner, and
Mm-hmm.
she was talking about how it could be potentially dangerous to plan too much for the situation we're in, because at some point this crisis will be over, and if you've over specialized into some niche that you've seen, and suddenly this is no longer a problem, what happens to your
Mm-hmm.
business?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, like you pointed that example of that client you're working with in travel. I think that makes so much sense, because travel is not going to happen right now, but you can think long term, because at some point this is going to be over. So let me set myself up for that situation.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are in a situation where you can do something about this news, the business conditions because of the pandemic, then sort out the short-term problem, but don't forget to consider the long-term implications of whatever you're doing now. I guess, like, from everything I've been hearing from what you're saying, you're really pushing businesses to set themselves up for success by
Yeah.
getting their fundamentals in place, right?
Yeah. It's about sustainability. I mean, like, you can have sustainable, consistent growth. But I think it's that pursuing that kind of short-term, rapid hockey stick growth that's causing a lot of very, a lot of difficulties with these businesses. So, like right now, if you, let's say, spent the last 3 years investing in like organic search and
Mm-hmm.
having evergreen content, right?
Mm-hmm.
The brands that I've been talking to that have a really solid search presence, they're not struggling nearly as much. I mean, obviously you have industry, dependent things, but they're really not, because think about it from this perspective. Let's say you don't have any sort of organic search presence. You're just strictly just paid traffic, for hypothetically, your e-commerce, you pay traffic only. All right. So that you got ad spend there, and there's a whole lot of factors that go into it.
Mm-hmm.
And the business, if you have a competitor that's, pretty much the same, but they have a really strong search presence, organic search presence, and they're getting all that, that's all free. I mean, obviously
Boom.
you have to
Better margin.
pay for it, but that makes their customer acquisition cost a lot lower. And so therefore, they're able to have a lot more of a buffer. So if they
Yeah.
got to cut back on their spend, if everyone has to cut back on their spend, well, they still have that revenue stream coming in.
And you could probably use the point you made earlier by saying, if they've got a very strong SEO presence, that probably would help them do better SEM, because now they know what keywords and things like that are going to work. And just
Mm-hmm.
if you're paying for ads and you've got organic results in the same page, you're probably more likely to get that click, right?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to, yeah, I mean, you would be able to do different things. So for example, if you had, paid ads and you had organic as well, it's like you could target different aspects of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So like you could have different messaging on there. I mean, going in with like, what you guys are doing at DataCue, it's like the personalization, that is a huge opportunity that is just not really being fully leveraged in most brands, even larger brands, but particularly like smaller ones. So, that's one of the things that we did this kind of strategic brand messaging testing. There's a lot of brands that we started working with where, frankly, their messaging was really confusing to me. I mean, it was straightforward, but I'm just like, okay, why are you guys doing this? Like, why are you guys going with that angle? And really, they couldn't give me a good reason. They're just like, well, it works, and that's what we've always done. And I'm like, okay, well, let's try some stuff. So we came up with, we did on one example, we actually did 14 different concepts. I don't mean just like individual concepts, but I mean like different kind of overarching category topics, and we picked 4. And we went and applied this to. We worked with the SEM agency and said, okay, well, let's apply this messaging across all their ads and do it systematically. So you have 4 ads with 4 different concepts, curated and tailored across the entire brand.
Same
And
audience though, right?
same, yeah. Everything else is the same. So it's a straight up, control, and then so it's control and then 3 other ads,
And 3 tests.
and we did it across everything. Yeah, And so we had millions and millions of clicks, and lots of impressions, and so quite a lot of data to be statistically significant. And we found overwhelmingly like two out of the three new ones did way better. I mean, almost
Oh,
double
wow.
the value per click, almost double the value per click. And
Mhm.
it blew us away. So, and then we did that on a product level. We also analyzed the exact same ads, and we segmented it down to a product level, even by a certain niche level, like certain non-branded kind of demographics. And we were able to see that it actually varied. It varied based on products and everything else. I mean, there was still one that was kind of overwhelmingly better, but there were certain ones that were different. So then we're like, okay, well now we can utilize this and tailor our landing pages and our messaging. And like, what if we did that across the entire brand? What would it do? And we just tailored everything according to that.
Mhm.
Email lists, everything, funnels, retargeting, what communities even for those specific type of products, like going back to Reddit, for example, like, okay, this kind of messaging resonates more. So let's, maybe that's a certain angle, certain kind of communities we could tie into that'll do this. I mean, the ideas were just explosive. And that was just off of one test that we did. So then, there's a whole bunch of other, series of tests that you can do. But I think there's so much data that is just not being utilized. And you can take what you're doing in paid search, what you're doing in paid social, what you're doing in this and that, or doing proper A/B tests on your website and
Right.
testing different messaging. How can you speak more directly to your audience and do that across everything? That is a huge opportunity that just I don't see most brands doing.
And I guess, at least for small businesses, one of the challenges is that there's always this feeling of being overwhelmed because you're
Mm-hmm.
kind of struggling to run your business. But then every time you're logging into LinkedIn or YouTube or what have you, there's this new thing that people are saying, you have to do this, you have to do that. But what I
Mm-hmm.
really like about what we've just discussed is that I think you've made things very simple, right? So it's sort of very structured. So it's really from, if I could try to summarize, it's like, okay, you've got blind spots. We all do. Try to
Mm-hmm.
find out which ones are the most valuable ones that you need to attack.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the one I liked your first point about too many people are really hell bent on this one marketing channel, and there could be so many others which you could look at.
Mm-hmm.
And then people aren't really thinking long term enough. So go back and think about your business plan and try to see, are you setting yourself up for success regardless of, because that maybe this pandemic is going to change. So are you setting yourself up? And the last
Mm-hmm.
one, I guess it's like, even if you're not huge, that's still not an excuse not to be testing, right? So even if you can't get millions of clicks on your Google ad accounts, I know that Google and Facebook are giving away ad credits right now to small businesses. So,
Mm-hmm.
get on that and test different messages and always try to see how can you be better. Have you guys been using anything with Google Optimize? I know that's free, and you can, I guess, people can try different messages on their site. Or do you typically prefer Google Ads to do these kind of messaging tests?
We've been doing a little bit of UX and a little bit of the brand messaging with the SEM. SEM's been easiest just because a lot of the brands that we were working with, they've already
Mhm.
kind of got all that stuff set up. So we're just going
Right.
in and just kind of systematically adjusting the ads. Whereas a just really kind of sad amount of brands are not doing any sort of A/B testing at all. And just it's not even just like, hey, let's try this one test. It's like even just getting the capabilities of setting up a CRO shop and in-house for some of the larger ones that we're working with has been kind of problematic. And that's where we kind of adapted this the framework or whatever by figuring out those issues and figuring out, okay, well, how can we implement this easier
Right.
across the board and some sort of a repeatable system. But I think the SEM route is a little bit easier just because it's more actionable. But if you have the capabilities, yeah, something like a Google, utilizing that, or like Unbounce or whatever else, there's plenty of
Sure.
tools out there for A/B testing, or like what you guys are doing. Absolutely, it seems like that's a good option as well.
Josh, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Can you, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff here, and I'm sure people would love to get in touch and hopefully have their questions answered. Is there anywhere that you recommend they get in touch with you?
Yeah, if you just go to purewebresults.com, go on there, shoot us a message on the contact form. One of the things that we're doing is, you know, really setting aside a good amount of time over the next like 3 to 6 months to try and help, businesses that are trying to navigate this. And I think there's a lot of ways that businesses can not only survive but thrive out of this. So if you shoot a message and just say, hey, you found us on this podcast or whatever else, I have no problem hopping on a call for like 45 minutes and just kind of giving you, some kind of a strategy call and giving you some advice, free of charge. It's just trying to help people out at this time.
Wow. Hey, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure having you on.
You too, brother. All right, take it easy.